Okay, so we finally have the first episode of the Daryl Dixon spinoff, and I loved it. I thought it was fabulous. Not terribly different from what we expected. There were quite a few things that were leaked from this episode and spoilers and such, but even so, I really enjoyed watching the storyline unfold, and there were plenty of Beth callbacks and TD symbolism that we are going to have a lot of fun analyzing, okay? So I've decided to, for right now, do my posts this way by using kind of an audio-visual format. And that way it just is a little bit faster when it comes to me actually being able to produce them. But I would love to hear your guys' comments and your feedback and tell me what you think. And if there's any aspect that you have a question on or that you would like me to cover in more detail, please just let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to do that. So I'm just going to jump in and we're going to start going through the episode chronologically, and I'll tell you kind of what I thought of each part and what it kind of brought to the surface for me. So, of course, we have the first part on the boat where he is tied onto the back of it and is mostly unconscious. One thing that I actually didn't notice when we were first getting the leaked scenes and, the first 10 minutes and everything was the birds that are flying above the boat. It just reminded me a lot of the birds that he and Beth look up at in Inmates in 410. It just kind of felt like a callback to that a little bit because he's kind of lying on his back. I mean, that was a conscious choice. They could have put him on his stomach lying on the boat, but no, he's lying on his back and there are birds flying above him. Of course, he falls into the water. He's got really blurry vision, but he makes it to shore. He's very weak, and he finds a pale bucket that has drinkable water in it. Now, that, too, is actually a really big symbol. Blue has been used a lot in the show, of course. It's a common color, but we saw it a lot around Beth at Grady. She was wearing blue scrubs for a lot of her time there. Not the entire time, but a lot of it. We've also seen it on other people. We've come to believe that it represents some sort of imprisonment. So Beth was wearing it at Grady because she was being kept prisoner there. We saw Heath wearing it not long before he disappeared into the CRM, that sort of thing. So we think it does represent an imprisonment of some kind. Now, does this mean that Daryl is going to be a prisoner because he drank out of the pale blue bucket? Maybe. I can see it happening at some point, right? Because he's got some bad guys after him. But I also think it's maybe to show that he was a prisoner before. So I'll get into that more when we get to the very end. The final scene of this episode was really interesting and has a lot of interesting implications for the setup here, but after that final scene, we definitely get the sense that when he was put on the boat originally, he was probably a prisoner. And the reason he's adrift now is because he broke out of that imprisonment. So I think that's probably what that blue bucket was there to symbolize, is that he's coming out of imprisonment. He needs water, and drinking water is sort of like also gaining freedom for him. Okay, so then we see him go wandering around. We see the sign in French, and one thing that really sticks out is that we see a walker with a spear through its eye. Now, it really focuses on that, and he looks at it several times. Anything where we have a missing eye like that is a Sirius symbol, meaning Sirius, the dog star, which is return symbolism, okay? So we can interpret this a few ways. It could be a foreshadow that Daryl is going to return to his family eventually, because right now, where Team Family is concerned, he is actually a serious figure. He has disappeared. They don't know where he is. He's gone from them. He's out of their sight. And, I'm assuming eventually he's going to get back to them, even if it takes a year or two, a season or two, whatever, you want to call it. I'm assuming he's going to return to them at some point. But never forget that we had really obvious, serious dog star symbolism around Beth. We actually had a one-eyed dog that was there and then disappeared, and we didn't see it come back, right? We heard it. Daryl heard it, or at least what he thought was it, barking and then, shaking their cans, which were their alarms, but we didn't actually see it again, which is important. So the fact that they have such obvious, serious symbolism at the beginning of this episode is really important. I think that it's a sign that the serious symbolism we've been seeing all along is going to be in this spinoff, and that it may well be fulfilled in the spinoff, which of course we believe means that Beth will return. Okay. He goes through the boat looking for supplies. He comes across some empty wine bottles, which is definitely an alcohol, symbol, kind of a nod to that. He comes across a recorder of a man who talks about trying to find a safe place for his family, and we find out that this man's wife dies at some point. She has a heart attack, and that the daughter is really missing her. The thing that jumped out to me about this, and I believe I said this when this footage, first 10 minutes came out several weeks ago, is that this guy really reminds me a lot of Herschel. I mean, he's a man who had a family, including daughters, and then his wife died. And it just feels like a really big callback to the Green family. Another thing that really jumps out is that the man says his and his wife's anniversary would have been in June, but specifically the 10th anniversary. Guys, it's been exactly 10 years since Coda and since Daryl saw Beth, and they went really out of their way to talk about a 10th anniversary of something. In the picture of the family, we see the little girl holding a penguin, and it's just a stuffed animal for her. I'm not sure exactly why a penguin. I'll have to look into that symbolism a little bit more, what a penguin represents. But what jumped out at me here is that we see Daryl kind of playing with the penguin. He actually finds that penguin in the boat that belonged to the little girl. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen this happen. The other time that comes to mind was in season 11 when they were in the subway, so that would have been Acheron parts 1 and 2. He finds a picture of a little boy and girl and a stuffed pink bunny rabbit. And I'm not sure, I don't remember for sure if it was him that actually handled the bunny rabbit, but I know Maggie did. She was holding it, and then she dropped it, and we see them kind of stepping on it and stepping over it as it got left behind. And we always sort of saw that as a semi-Beth symbol, both because it's a rabbit, and we've seen rabbit symbolism around her before, but also because Maggie was holding it and then dropped it and left it behind. And that feels like a little bit of a callback to what happened with Beth. She didn't think, Maggie didn't think the rabbit was important. She needed to leave it behind to fulfill the mission she was on. All of that is fine, but that's kind of how she sort of, in a symbolic way, might have felt about Beth. They didn't think she was alive. They needed to safeguard the living, so they left her behind. Well, in this case, we don't see that exactly. We just see that Daryl finds this penguin and is just kind of holding it and messing around with it in the evening as he's cooking dinner. And I don't know, plenty of us have theorized that maybe he might see a picture of Beth, and that might be how he comes to know that she's alive. It is just a theory. We don't know for sure that that's the case, obviously. Another thing that I always said is that he might see her from a distance, but not up close. He'd see her from a distance first, but that actually could work with the photograph theory. I mean, it's just another way of the same thing, seeing her without actually being face to face with her. And what we're seeing in both cases is that he saw something in a photograph and then he found it in real life. And I think that's significant. I think that's a theme. And so it was interesting to me that we saw that again. In the market, when he sees the walkers, again, this was a scene that was leaked before, and this is where he gets burned on his arm. So it's the first time, actually, I think it's the first time he's seeing any live walkers at all. He seems really, really shocked when he sees them, but I think the idea is that this is the first time he's come across a live walker since he washed ashore, so it was just a little bit jarring for him. But of course, this is also the first time he's learning that these walkers have acidic blood, and that they're kind of a whole different breed than what he's used to, and he actually gets burned by one of them. As I said when this first leaked, this particular scene, it reminded me a lot of the big spot scene from 401. Now, the biggest reason is because he jumps up on a table and starts fighting walkers that way, and it's very, very similar to what he does in the big spot, which in that case, he jumped up on a pyramid of beer cases and was fighting him that way. So in both cases, we have him surrounded by walkers. He's in a market of some kind where things were once for sale, and he jumps up kind of onto a higher platform in order to fight the walkers. It just feels a little bit like a parallel. Now, the interesting thing about that is that 401, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail right now. I've got posts about it if you want to look back, but it was definitely a foreshadow of Beth's arc. Okay, we actually see a blonde who is shot in the forehead in the same place she is, a blonde walker in that case. We have Sasha stabbing a walker up through the eye specifically, and Sinequa Martin Green talked about how she loved that sequence. She thought it was super cool and super fun to do, but it was planned very specifically to get that walker in the eye, which means they were going for the serious symbolism, right? So all I'm saying is that it's not that important that this scene was a callback to the big spot. What's more important is that the big spot was a foreshadow of Beth's arc, and if they're redoing it now, that could be to show that Beth is coming back around and that this arc is finally going to be fulfilled. So then we have the opening credits, and I thought they were super cool. We see a lot of the art. So I've been talking a little bit about some of the promos that the AMC social media accounts have been doing, and we see a lot of that artwork in the opening credits. We also see blood, and not just Walker blood and gore in the way that we normally would in Walking Dead. We see blood flowing through tubes. We see anatomical books. So I think that shows that this is going to deal a lot with the idea of a cure and the virus itself and the human body, and that's really, really important. I'll talk about that more near the end. So they were pretty cool, the opening credits. I really liked them, and I plan to study them a little bit more and to see if they change at all. I don't really expect them to change. The only spinoff that has had the opening credits change episode by episode is Fear, but even Dead City didn't do that, so I assume the Daryl Dixon credits will stay the same. Okay, so that was actually the extent of what I had seen going in. I know that some people saw more, especially there was more shown at Comic-Con, but going into the episode to watch it, that was the extent of what I had seen, just ending with after the market when he was burned. So the next thing we see, other than him walking, which we had seen before, was him stopping at a car to wrap his arm. Now, it jumped out at me that he was stopping at a car. Nothing really happened. He didn't see anyone in the back of the car. They didn't emphasize it very much, but one of Team Delusional's long-standing theories is that Beth was left in the back of a car. So anytime a character passes a car and the back door is open, or, you know, they make a point of doing a scene by a car left on the side of the road, it just captures my attention. I didn't really think much of it when I was first watching this scene, but I'll come back to why it was probably important. So he's wrapping his arm and he sees someone watching him from afar. It turns out to be Isabel. This is important only because, again, I'll get into it. It doesn't really, you can't see the full picture until we get to the next scene, but another theory that we've had is that maybe he will see Beth from a distance or hear her over the radio, or, as I talked about, see her in a picture, you know, something like that. So we have him seeing this woman who is blonde, and she's watching him from a distance. He also sees a sign, which he translates using his little French phrase book, that says, "God loves you," and he scoffs at that. He thinks it's stupid. Again, all of this is going to end up being important. But for the most part, that's really all that happens in that scene, and then he moves on. He does not try to go toward Isabel. He clearly doesn't really care who she is. He just keeps going. And then he comes to a new place, kind of broken down building of a place, and there are some cans strung across the passageway as an alarm. Now, that is a major callback to Alone, where he specifically used cans at the funeral home with Beth. And those cans are the signal, you know, it's what they heard that made Daryl go to the front door, and then there were all those walkers there. So not only is it a callback to when him and Beth were together, it's also a callback to the catalyst, to everything that happened that made her get taken to Grady, that separated them, that led to her getting shot, all of it. So that's a really important symbol. But it's interesting because at first he steps over them, and so he doesn't actually trigger the alarm, but then he starts backing up. He doesn't want to be seen, and he forgets about them and accidentally bumps into them. And sure enough, trouble ensues. So it's being used in a very similar way. At that point, he, you know, shows himself to these people. It turns out to be a young woman who, at first, I could not tell if it was Laurent or not. She actually looks a lot like Laurent, but it's not. It's a young woman and a man who she says is her grandfather. She asks if he has any first aid supplies and if they could exchange that for food. And so he does. He gives her just the first aid kit he found from the boat, and then he takes some apples. So we have apples. Apples are important. We've gone on and on about the apples. Remember that apples are always a symbol of separation and then reunion, right? So we actually saw apples with Rick and Michonne in season 6. And they were a foreshadow, I believe, in the long run, of Rick leaving the show and him and Michonne being separated. And they've pretty much, you know, confirmed that they're going to reunite at some point. We have the Rick and Michonne spinoff coming up. And Gimple has said it's going to be one of the great love stories of the series. So, of course, and we've seen apples around that. But we also saw them when Connie came back, and that was not a romantic reunion. It was just a reunion among friends. So the point of the apple is not romantic or non-romantic. It is simply a reunion after time spent apart. Now, here is where that scene with Daryl by the car and Isabel becomes important. You could ask, what do these apples represent? Who is Daryl going to reunite with? Well, naturally, our answer that we're hoping the most for is Beth. You could also argue, theoretically, that it might just be a foreshadow of him eventually reuniting with Team Family back home, with Judith, with Aaron, with Carol, with all of them, right? Or even with Rick at some point in the future, because we figure that is going to happen eventually too. But here's the thing that I thought of. And this is what The Walking Dead does so well, and why I have so much respect for The Walking Dead writers. You have, obviously, the main storyline that's going on the surface, and that's very important. And then you have all of the symbolism, which is like a second level, and of course you have subplots and smaller plots and things that are going on the side. But they can also put these little micro scenes into, or I guess you would call them micro plots or micro stories, and they can just go scene by scene and be really small. But the great thing about it is that it all revolves around the same theme, and that's why it feels so cohesive when they're telling these stories. Well, like I said, when I first noticed that Daryl stopped at the car to wrap his arm up, I didn't really think too much of it. The car caught my attention, but it was just sort of a note I made in the back of my head, but it didn't really seem to be leading to anything. But here's the thing. On a really small scale, these apples could actually foreshadow him reuniting with Isabel. And what I mean by that is, of course, they weren't really in one another's presence because he was seeing her from a distance, but they were looking at each other, like all of 20 seconds of eye contact, right? And then he left. So they were kind of in the same space, and then they separated as he went on his way down the road. But then she comes back and sees him again and helps him. So, again, maybe that's really small potatoes, a really small reunion that we don't really care that much about yet because there hasn't been much of a relationship between him and Isabel other than just seeing each other from a distance. But think about it this way. Maybe this is the point of him stopping at the car. One of our long-held theories is that Beth was left behind in a car, right? She was probably put in there to protect her from walkers, and then Team Family was going to come back and bury her as soon as they could. But they, by the time they got there, her body was gone, and this is why we have Daryl looking at the blonde walker on the tree in 5:15, and all these theories that have been around for a while, right? But maybe in this scene, it was a foreshadow of Beth. So I'm going to talk as we go along about how Isabel really, really is not going to be a romantic interest for Daryl. We've known that from the beginning, but that doesn't mean that she's not a symbolic stand-in for Beth in some ways. So think about it this way. We have him looking at this blonde woman who he's seeing at a distance, and he has stopped at a car, and he's in pain. He's trying to bind up his arm. That could be a symbolic callback to him leaving Beth, the blonde, at a car, and he was in pain at that point because he believed her to be dead. Then he walks on down the road. And there's even, thrown in this idea of, you have this God loves you sign, which Beth was a person of faith, and he scoffs at it, okay? Back, even in season 4, he scoffed at Beth when she said it wouldn't hurt him to have a little faith, and he said, faith ain't done shit for us. And then, of course, understandably, when he lost her, he was not in a faithful frame of mind. He was in a very dark frame of mind. Anyway, the point is, he keeps going down the road, and then that blonde comes back and helps him and saves his life. So, again, it could be a foreshadow of him meeting Beth on the road eventually, right? And Isabel is a stand-in, and it's a little tiny foreshadow. It lasts all of 2 scenes. It lasts all of 5 minutes, but it's still there. So that then becomes maybe why it's significant that he stopped at the car. That was a very purposeful choice on the part of the writers to throw that car in there rather than just having him stop on the side of the road or on a bench or something else, right? Okay. So we have those apples. Those were pretty significant. There was a lot of things in this scene that jumped out at me. Daryl has a very short conversation specifically with this woman's grandfather, and they talk about World War II. We've noticed over the years a lot of references to historical wars. They have referenced Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, the what else has there been? There's been a lot of them. And we think the main reason for that, it's not about the particular wars themselves that are being referenced, but rather that there is eventually going to be a massive war between the CRM and Team Family. That's kind of the storyline that they've been building toward for years. And they've alluded to it in a lot of different ways. They did it a lot during All Out War back in season 8. There was a lot of symbolic foreshadows there. And I think this is just more of the same. You know, it's talking about World War II. People talk about Daryl washing up like a soldier at Normandy. I mean, I think these are just foreshadows of more wars to come, but they're still really interesting to hear about. So then we get some bad guys arriving. We don't really know who they are yet, but they tell Daryl to sit down, and then they try to take the woman somewhere. We don't know exactly what their intentions are, but the point is she does not want to go with them. Maybe she knows that they're really bad guys. And so Daryl, being Daryl, he lunges into action. He helps her. But then something super interesting happens, kind of a plot twist. The girl and her grandfather actually hit Daryl over the head and take all of his stuff and take off with it. So they may not be evil people, but they're not the most honorable, upstanding people either. But one other thing that really jumped out at me here is that the grandfather was faking his blindness. Okay, there's so many things about that are important. First of all, the first thing that jumped into my head, and maybe this is a little bit convoluted, but back in season 6, we had the episode, The Same Boat, where Maggie and Carol were taken hostage by Paula and a group of saviors, right? And that episode was filmed on the same set as the Saw movie. And the reason that was important is because there's a major resurrection at the end of the Saw movie. A man who is pretending to be dead, he's literally playing possum, and specifically with a gunshot wound to the head, stands up, and it turns out he was faking the whole time and he's actually alive. Now, this is a little bit less dramatic than that because the man is not faking death, he's faking blindness, but that's what it reminded me of. Someone pretending to be blind when they really aren't. And there was a possum on the porch in Still around Beth, as though faking death is going to be some part of her arc. So when we see someone faking something like this, it just always jumps out at me. Then there's the fact that it's blindness. I mean, we've talked about how blindness, especially in one eye, is a serious symbol. Just not being able to see is a major theme that they use a lot in The Walking Dead. And there's a lot of, just deception going on here. And it's just really, really interesting. A lot of really potent symbols going on here. But the point is, they betray Daryl. They take his stuff. They hit him over the head. They leave him there. And at this point, poor Daryl has had just a rough day, okay? He's burned his arm. He's still very, very tired and probably very dehydrated. He hasn't had much to eat. Then he actually gets shot in the neck. I even forgot to mention that. When he was fighting with these guys, they fire at him and get him in the neck, and it just grazes the outer part of his neck. But still, he got shot in the neck, and he's bleeding, and that's a big deal. And then he gets hit over the head. So at this point, he decides he's done with the world and he passes out. But before he passes out, we see Isabel coming toward him. And so that's yet another example of seeing someone at a distance, not being able to see them clearly because his vision is blurred. But this is a blonde who's coming toward him, and it is reminiscent of Beth in a lot of ways. So the next thing we're going to see is him wake up at the monastery. But before that, there's just this half-second scene where we see a river. And that jumped out at me because back in Find Me, which was 10:18 with Leah, we saw the river a lot. Okay, there were a lot of sweeping shots of the river. We saw a lot of Daryl walking in or beside the river while he was looking for Rick. So this is a really potent symbol of Daryl's journey. And I believe that's what the river represents, is Daryl's journey while he's searching for people. And so we saw a picture of the river. It was really, really short, like blink and you miss it. But before we saw him wake up at the monastery, the point is that we can connect those two things. What was being foreshadowed in Find Me is now being fulfilled in the Daryl spinoff. Okay, he is on his journey at this point. And I didn't specifically mention it earlier when I talked about the opening credits, but there is one shot in the opening credits where Daryl is like sitting up high looking over Paris, and you can see the Seine River, which is the big river that flows through it, and it looks like it's a river of blood. And that's interesting for a lot of reasons. Of course, it's a horror show. There are walkers and zombies, and so there's a lot of blood inherent in the show, but it's also very biblical symbolism in terms of the Exodus story and the rivers of Egypt being turned to blood. So just interesting, and that shot of the river did jump out at me. Okay, so then we see him waking up in the convent. There are a lot of similarities between when he wakes up in the convent and when Beth woke up at Grady, so I want you guys to be looking for those. The first thing, of course, is that there is medical equipment laying around. And, you know, it would be one thing if it was just a medical setting, because, of course, you're going to have similarities there. But I believe it's an emesis basin. It's kind of a lima bean shape. And we specifically saw that at Grady with scissors and cotton in it. And we see the exact same thing sitting by Daryl's bed. The only difference is that this one is metal and the one at Grady was plastic. Like, literally, the only difference, right? We do see them cauterizing his arm, and so we hear him yelling, and it distracts the other nuns. But when he wakes up in the bed, when Isabel comes in and talks to him, he's also got a white wrap around his arm. Guys, that's exactly like Beth, okay? She wakes up, she's kind of groggy, a little bit hazy about how she got there. She's got this wrap around her arm because she was hurt. I mean, all of those, exactly the same for Daryl in this situation. And then, to add to that, when Isabel leaves for a minute, she locks his door. I don't know if you caught that. You hear the door lock. Remember when Beth woke up, she went and pounded on the door and had to yell because her door was locked and she was locked in. Now, I think there's a good reason for that, like a logical reason. It's because when someone is sick and maybe dying and you don't know if they're going to pull through, in this world, they could become a walker if they die. So it just makes good logical sense to lock the door until you're sure that they're going to pull through and you're not going to have them waking up as Patrick did at the prison and going around biting everybody, right? So I think that's why they do it. But the point is, we saw the exact same thing at Grady as we did here with Daryl. And that's important, okay? There's a lot of parallels going on there. We also see that the nuns are singing in French. Now, maybe Beth didn't actually wake up to singing. She was the one who did the singing. But again, they're callbacks to Beth. We have women that are singing here, okay? And that just feels like a Beth thing to me. We learn about different kinds of walkers, including the burners from Isabel. They're also really specific in giving us a time frame here. They say it's been 12 years. We are 12 years into the apocalypse. Guys, that's really important. I mean, they're trying to give us a timeline here. Now, from everybody who's kind of done the math of what we know of the timeline, because we know the writers are very vague about it. It is hard to nail down the timeline in the show, and I know that the writers do that purposefully. But from what we could tell, Grady and Coda happened 2 to 2.5 years into the apocalypse. And so that's why, like I said, it's been about 10 years since he saw Beth, and they are very specific about saying it's been 12 years since the turn. So keep that in mind. They're really throwing that in purposely to try to give us some sort of timeline here. Then we have Isabel leaves for a minute. We have Daryl looking out the window. He sees the nuns playing games with Laurent, and he's wondering who this kid is. And then he takes a bath. And guys, I literally was laughing watching this scene because there was so much drama online about how this was going to be a sexual thing and him and Isabel were going to have an affair. And it just, you guys, I mean, I never thought that would be the case. I 100% thought that was a load of crap and that she was just taking care of him and it was more of a doctor-patient sort of thing. I 100% believe that, but I still had to laugh at how right that was. I mean, there is zero sexual tension in this scene. To say that is just ridiculous. It's just not there at all. He has a thing where he sort of leans back in the bath and falls asleep a little bit, and he does this sort of nightmare thing about being under the water, and then he sits up really suddenly, almost as though he couldn't breathe for a minute. I mean, it's definitely a PTSD thing after the trauma of being on the ocean as long as he was. And if he was at all uncomfortable, it was just that. It was, she walked in right after he did that, and I think he might have been a little bit embarrassed at his own fear. But after that, when she walks over to him, I mean, he doesn't show any discomfort at all about her being there. They just talk as though things are completely normal. So again, I just kind of had to laugh at all the drama that went on online, and there was nothing remotely like that in the scene. He does open up to her a little bit, but honestly, it's less than I thought it would be. She asks him about the scars on his back, and he says his daddy was a smoker. She asks if he had any siblings, and he said, yeah, a brother. And she tells him she had a sister. I mean, that's really it. I mean, it's not like to hear it from the people online, it sounded like it was going to be some big, deep conversation where he opened up to her like he's never opened up to anyone else on the show. And guys, these were like one-liners. It was not that big a deal. And not that I minded. I don't mind if he opens up to her, but it just, people, once again, the internet likes to blow things out of proportion. That's all. I do have a note here that when he was looking at all the religious art on the wall, it reminded me a little bit of the art in Father Gabriel's church. A lot of hand-drawn things, and it, just possibly could be a callback to season 5. The other big thing in this scene is that Isabel has scars on her wrist. So once again, I'm going to reiterate, even though I do not at all believe that she will be a love interest for Daryl, she is a stand-in for Beth in a lot of ways. She is a callback to her, and now we have these scars on the wrist. I mean, guys, there are some things that you could say, oh, maybe it's Beth, maybe it's something else, but these are not one of them, okay? There is nobody else in the show that this could be indicating or calling back to except Beth. She is the only one who had scars on her wrist like this. And Daryl specifically referenced them when they were fighting in Still, okay? So this is not reminding him of Carol. This is not reminding him of Aaron. This is not reminding him of Merle or Rick. The only person that could remind him of is Beth. And again, that is a purposeful choice on the part of the writers to put that in. So do with that what you will. And also keep in mind that he did open up to her. In a way, it's just reminiscent of Beth. I mean, he opened up to Beth in a way he never had to anyone else in season 4. And now he is talking to Isabel a little bit about his family and his background. Not much yet. But then she has the scars like Beth too. So you can see that there's parallels there. You just can't get away from. I mean, he talked to Beth about Merle. He told her stories about Merle that he had never told anyone before. And in this case, like I said, it's small. It was literally just, I had a brother, and that was it. But the fact that he's talking to her about his brother, he's talking to her about scars, and she has scars like Beth. I mean, there's nothing else this could be, you guys. You can't explain it away any other way. Okay. All right, so let's move on. After that, she's showing him around. He is drawn to the armory. Of course he is. He's Daryl. But we did notice the black and white diamond pattern of the floor. Black and white is a Bethel thing. Remember Beth's shoelaces at Grady, and then Daryl had the ties on his legs in them, which was when he was obviously very heavily mourning for Beth. And then the diamonds. We've always said, I've really old posts about how Beth is the queen of diamonds when it comes to poker suits. But we saw a diamond on the table in Alone directly between them. So the diamond is a Bethel symbol as well. And they're black and white. You see how all these things work together. Just one thing might just be random, but all of them together, Isabel, the car, the scars, the black and white, the diamonds. I mean, it has to be intentional. He also sees the radio in the office. The radio is another potent symbol. One thing a lot of people have thought over the years is that he might hear Beth's voice on the radio, or possibly Rick's, and that could play into the plot somehow. So the radio's kind of a big deal. It'll be interesting to see if that goes anywhere. Then we finally have him meeting Laurent. I thought Laurent was adorable, actually. I read a couple of negative reviews in those articles we talked about where they thought he was annoying, or that it was just too cliche, or I don't know. They just didn't seem to like it all the time. But I thought Laurent was really cute, and he was showing off his book smarts for sure. But that's what kids his age do. He's trying to impress Daryl, and I loved that whole scene. I loved their interactions. I thought it was cute. Of course, he repeats what Judith says about Daryl needing a happy ending, which is important. So then we switch to a scene where the bad guys, Cordon, finds the woman and her grandfather who robbed Daryl. And they unfortunately kill the grandfather, and they take her because they want her to show them where it happened. Cordon is looking for his brother. So they just basically say, you're coming with us. And that's that. Meanwhile, back at the convent, we have learned that there used to be a guy named Father Jean there, and he died at some point. But rather Daryl hears what sounds like a walker, and when he follows it, he finds Laurent reading poetry to the walker form of Father Jean, and that really pisses him off. This is definitely a callback to Herschel and the Green family keeping walkers in the barn. Of course, we've seen it a few other times since then as well, such as with the governor, but there it is, and Daryl just obviously does not have any respect for this, so he gets really upset and tries to leave. Now, Isabel, it's then that she starts following him around, explaining that she wants him to take Laurent somewhere, that she thinks he's the messenger, that Laurent is special, all of that. She also reveals that the radio is actually broken, and that ticks him off too, because she fibbed about that before, and he's not happy about that. The biggest thing here that really jumped out at me that was fun was the map. So there is a red route on the map that is marked with string or yarn of some kind. Now, I don't know how many of you remember this, but talking about the green route back in the day was a big part of Team Delusional's theories. We saw the phrase for green route on Morgan's wall in Clear, and that was in season 3. And of course, nobody had any idea what it meant then. But then in season 5, in Consumed, when Daryl and Carol were very actively looking for Beth in the plot, there was a green route going on around them. There were green arrows that kept pointing them to certain parking garages or onto certain streets, and it was all in the background. You have to actively look for it because the camera didn't focus on it. It was there, but the writers were they're kind of hiding it in plain sight. They weren't making sure that everyone noticed it. So it did seem like the green route is what pointed them to Beth. Now, the other thing that you have to remember is that green and red on this show go together. And we have come to believe that they mean basically that the whole cycle of death and resurrection. So they do mean resurrection in the long term, but if you were to break it down, the red probably means the first step, which is death, and you have to have death in order to have resurrection, right? And the second part is green, which is the resurrection part. So you could explain it a few different ways, and different people have, but the idea is that when we see the red and the green, it leads to death and resurrection. So in season 6, we saw Maggie wearing red shoelaces, and when she climbed the ladder after the church fell, there was a green cord in the same shot. So you had red and green, and I think that represented Glenn's death fake out. First there was the death part, and then there was the resurrection part, right? So I think that we could see something similar here. They specifically made the route red rather than green. And I think there's a few different ways you can interpret that. This is either leading to a death of some kind, and who knows who it will be. It could be Isabel, it could be Laurent. It could just be like a symbolic death in general. Things are just not going to go well, that sort of thing. But then it will be followed by a green route, which I think will lead to Beth. The other way that you could possibly see this is that when they followed the green route in season 5, it did lead to her, but that did also lead to what was apparently her death. It was her getting shot and them believing she was dead. So now if it's a red route, it's sort of the opposite, and maybe it will lead to her being revealed as alive, that sort of thing, because it is kind of the opposite. If we do end up seeing Beth at the end of this journey, and I very much believe we will, Daryl was actively looking for Beth before. He's not actively looking for her now. He's doing something else, but you can see that they're kind of mirror opposites. And so if he ends up finding her, it'll be sort of the opposite of what happened in season 5. Anyway, different ways that you can interpret that, but it's really interesting. Okay, but ultimately, Daryl is not convinced by Isabel at this point. He just kind of says, nope, I'm done. I'm leaving. Good luck with everything. Meanwhile, we did see a scene where Codron, our bad guy, has taken that gal who robbed Daryl back to the scene of the crime, and he's looking for his brother. Now, his brother was stabbed through the heart and killed, but obviously they didn't end up stabbing his brain because he's up and walking around as a walker. Now, the thing that struck me here is that it was a major parallel to Daryl killing Merle. All right, so much like that, Codron found his brother as a walker, walking around. He did have to put him down, and he cried when he did it. You really do feel his pain at having lost his brother. And all that tells us is that this guy is definitely set up as a foil for Daryl. He's a lot like Daryl, except that the major difference, which is that he's a bad guy and Daryl's a good guy, and they're obviously going to butt heads. But we are seeing a lot of similarities as well between him and Daryl. So Daryl leaves the monastery, just planning to get where he needs to go, figure out some way to get home. But while he's on the road, he does see Codron and his men in jeeps heading for the monastery. And it's important that it's really clear that that's where they're headed, and they just don't seem to be the best of guys. He saw similar guys, Codron's brother, attacking people on the road, and so he knows that these guys are bad news. As soon as they get there, things get kind of interesting. They tell the nuns that they're coming in one way or the other, so the abbess might as well let them in, which she does, but they immediately go to try and hide Laurent. And it's not clear exactly why they would want to hide him, but it's interesting. They immediately go put him in Father Jean's office and tell him not to come out and not to make any noise. They actually do hear him. So when Codron goes in, he hasn't locked the door yet, and they hear him lock the door. And they are just about to bust into the office when they hear kind of a commotion and go toward that instead. And what it is that one of Codron's men has found Père Père Jean, Father Jean, as a walker. Now, clearly they haven't seen this before. They want to know why the abbess is keeping a walker this way. And they basically say that they have beliefs about the soul and they want to keep him alive. It's a little unclear still why the nuns think that, why they want that. I mean, they're keeping the walker of this former priest alive, but they haven't done that with anybody else. And clearly they've lost people. So it's still a little unclear why they did that. But perhaps it's just to keep hope alive. It's a little bit twisted, but we saw Herschel and the Greens do it too. You know, people, they do some strange things when they're confronted with stuff like this. Clearly Caudron wants to kill this walker, and he starts telling one of his men, whose name is Philippe, to kill him. Now, this is where we get into another little tiny micro plot that's going on. We see Caudron telling Philippe, who is not a major character, to put down this walker. But the mother abbess goes to Philippe and says, "I remember you. Your parents used to worship here. Please don't do this." And Philippe genuinely struggles over it. He seems to not want to do it, but he wants to do what his commander is telling him. And we see that he's really conflicted about this. But eventually he just says, you know, "Forgive me, Father," and then he does stab the walker in the eye. So we have, once again, more serious symbolism because they went through the eye. They could have done that any way they wanted, guys. Most of the time we see them stab people in the side of the head, like above the ear. And of course it works to stab them through the eye, but when they do that, it's purposeful, because when you're losing an eye, it's serious dog star symbolism. So we have more serious symbolism, okay? We had it at the beginning with the walker by the boat. We had it with the apples, which is return symbolism. We're seeing resurrection symbolism. And now we got this priest who is a walker and was put down through the eye. The reason that I say that this is a little micro plot is because 2 scenes later, when all the fights start, Philippe is killed. He's killed in the action between Daryl and Caudron, and it's actually Caudron who kills him by mistake. He's firing at Daryl, and Daryl kind of uses Philippe as a shield. But the point is, this is something that the writers would have put in on purpose, okay? Philippe basically betrays his own faith, and then he dies in the next scene for it. And that is thematic. That is put there on purpose as a theme, okay? So just something to notice and keep in mind. I love noticing these little details. But back to what was happening. They stabbed the walker, and then we kind of get a taste of why the nuns were hiding Laurent, because Laurent comes running out saying, no, because he didn't want the walker to be killed either. And clearly, Caudron and his men are surprised that there's a child here. They didn't know about him. And they ask why he's here, and the nuns just say, "Oh, his parents died, we took him in." They immediately try to take Laurent. And we don't know why. We don't know what they would have done with him, but it's yet another example of children being taken by some bigger entity. We have seen this forever, guys. It's a major foreshadow of what's going on. We saw it foreshadowed in small ways in the flagship show, with Judith being kidnapped when she was 2 by Michonne's friend Jocelyn. And, you know, in most of those smaller storylines, they got the kids back, but it's a foreshadow of this happening on a bigger scale. We saw it again in what season was that? 10, I think, when Hilltop burned down, and then they couldn't find any of the kids, so Daryl and Ezekiel and Jerry all went looking for them, right? And then very recently in Fear, we've seen this on a much more obvious scale, where we had Padre, who was actually sort of paying people to go out and take kids from their families because they believed that they could raise them better than their parents could. Okay, so we have long believed that this is going to be a major storyline with the CRM, and that it's something Beth will be involved in. She had a lot of child and baby symbolism around her. It's what she did. She took care of kids. And we think she's going to be involved in this, but it will be on a grand scale with the CRM. Now, we do not know at this point if Caudron and these French people are at all a part of the CRM. What happens in the final scene suggests that they might be, but we don't know for sure. Either way, they were trying to take Laurent for something. And I doubt that they're part of Padre, that they're kind of in the wrong part of the world. And in Fear, the Padre storyline is mostly over. So it can't be that. But they might have ties to the CRM. And it's very interesting that they immediately tried to take Laurent. So it's, you know, you wonder why. And you wonder what's up with that. Because Caudron and his men clearly are not religious. I wouldn't say they respect the nuns. They leave them alive as long as they're not considered a threat. But as we see here in this episode, the instant they're considered a threat, they just mow down over them. They don't have any problems killing the nuns. So it's not really respect out of religion, So if they don't respect the nun's religion, then they don't believe what the nuns believe about Laurent. So why do they want him? That's the big question. Well, naturally, Daryl being Daryl, he comes in and saves the day, or at least he stops them from taking Laurent, and a huge fight ensues in which, unfortunately, most of the nuns are killed. Daryl does manage to shoot Caudron, but not fatally, and Caudron gets away in one of the Jeeps. Then we have this scene with Daryl and the Reverend Mother when she passes away. I thought the scene was so sweet. It was one of my favorites of the episode. It was both heartwarming and heart-wrenching because she does unfortunately pass away, but she takes his hand and she says that she understands that he's not a believer, but there are reasons all around for him to believe. And it just feels very Beth-like, and the idea of faith. I have a note here that I forgot to read, that when Isabel was first trying to convince him to help them, she said everything happens for a reason, and that just feels like something Beth would say, right? So we have this scene, and the Reverend Mother also says that Laurent is a cure for a sick world. We're not sure exactly what that means. I mean, from the point of view of Isabel and the nuns, they believe he is a Messiah, which is very religious. So that line would be symbolic mostly in a religious way. But you can't help but wonder if the writers are putting it that way because he's going to have ties to a cure, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that they're saying he is a cure for a sick world when we are talking about a zombie virus. And then the abbess tells Isabel that maybe Daryl really is the one. Remember that she was the one who was telling her earlier in the episode that Daryl needed to leave. He was not a believer. He didn't belong there, but now she's saying, okay, well, maybe he is the one who's meant to help you. And then she passes away. So in the final scene that concerns Daryl anyway, we see them, the survivors, around the fire. There are really only 4 of them, right? There is Daryl, Isabel, Laurent, and then there's one more nun whose name I do not know. I don't know if it said her name or not, but if it did, sorry, I forgot to write it down. She starts singing around the fire, and then Laurent pulls out a guitar. Okay, so once again, we have a major callback here. It's a huge callback to the scene in 301 where Team Family is all sitting around the fire in the yard of the prison, and Beth starts to sing. And then there's the guitar. I think we have seen 1 or 2 people with guitars other than Beth. I want to say Luke probably played one in season 9 when him and Alden were preparing to sing right before the Whisperers beheaded everyone. But it's still a callback to Beth. She had one in 509, which was the last episode she was in. And, by itself, maybe it wouldn't mean much, but taken with all the other symbols we've seen in this episode, it's a big deal. And the fact that they're sitting around a fire, okay, and it's nighttime, and all of this has happened. So we learn that they've buried all of the dead. And as they sing, Daryl does tell Isabel that he will help her get Laurent where she wants him to go if she will help him find the port afterward, because he still wants to get back to his family in the States. And that's kind of where they leave Daryl's story in this episode. But there is one more scene after that. In a way, this scene is kind of a coda. It's not after the credits, so it's not a coda in that way. It's just presented as the final scene, but it's outside of Daryl's main story. It's something else that's going on in a different place that they want us to know about. It's in the, I think you say it, the Havre port, which is where he wants to go because that's where the ships are, and he's planning to go there in order to try and find a ship home. And clearly this is a dangerous place, and it's not going to be a very safe place for him to be because we have this ship. And it becomes really obvious that this is the ship that he jumped off of and how he ended up in the ocean. And what they say is that they kind of give us some tantalizing hints here. There is a doctor who says that most of his research is ruined. Now, this is a callback to Dr. Edwards at Grady. We found out that even though he was an acting doctor at Grady because they needed doctors and he was a doctor, before the turn, he was a research doctor. And that gives him ties to the cure theory because we think he may have been doing research for a cure. There was a lot of really vague things going on at Grady that they clearly were not giving us details about that we think are tied to research on a cure. So we have this doctor saying the research was ruined, and then he points to a group of people that are clearly walkers and says, maybe some of the test subjects might still be viable. So it's unclear if the test subjects were originally alive and, just got killed and so now they're walkers, or if they were always walkers that were being tested upon. Either way, Daryl was put on this boat, and he does tell Isabel that somebody put him on the boat. And then we learned that the people on the boat were involved in research, and whether they were dead or alive, they had test subjects, and that Daryl escaped from this boat. So that really heavily suggests that Daryl was meant to be a test subject. So what does that mean? Well, we noticed that in the flagship show, they really focused a lot on Daryl giving Judith his blood, and it did revitalize her. Now, was that just because she had lost blood and needed a transfusion? Yeah, maybe. But what if it's more than that? What if there are certain people in the world with certain qualities in their blood that can be used to, possibly create a cure? And it doesn't even mean that that's actually what will happen. It just means that that is what certain factions believe will happen. And so they're taking prisoners. And chances are these people who are test subjects are not going to see the light of day again. Okay. Anyway, the point is, this could be a really big tie to the CRM. We have long believed that Grady had ties to the CRM. That was not something that was said in season 5. They were very, very vague and nebulous about what was going on there. But Dawn kept saying that somebody was coming to get them, and Beth thought she was crazy, and so did the audience. She just comes across as completely delusional, but what if there really was somebody that she was talking to who had promised to come get her and her community? Meanwhile, they were doing research of some kind on people. Now, in the World Beyond spinoff, we got a lot more insight into this. We actually saw the CRM doing experiments on people. They were killing people with a green gas. I want to say it was a chlorine gas. I can't remember for sure. And they were trying to record the amount of time it took people to turn and things like that. So they were obviously researching the virus and trying to understand it better and all of that, but they were killing people to do it. So they were not practicing very great ethics in doing this. So my point is that if Daryl was put on a boat and taken somewhere, this could have ties to the CRM, and we believe that Beth and clearly Rick, because they've shown us that, are inside the CRM somewhere. So you can see these storylines starting to come together in some way. And it's interesting that Daryl was on this boat. And my big question is, why was he, of all people, put on the boat? There must have been a reason for that. Meanwhile, because he escaped and because he screwed a lot of things up and pissed a lot of people off, now they're looking for him and are trying to kill him. So yeah, that was a super interesting scene. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. All right. Well, this is mostly what I have for the first episode. I really loved it. I love the way that the storyline is playing out. I love the whole ambiance of it. I think it's great. And if you guys want me to go over anything else, if you have any questions, let me know. You can send them to my inbox or reply in the comments, either way, and I will do my best to answer your questions. Meanwhile, I cannot wait for episode 2. Most of the reviewers were saying that 5 and 6 are the best episode, but also I've heard that episode 2 is really great. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention that I'm really excited about is they had a preview, and I don't think the preview was just for episode 2. I think it was for the entire series coming up. But we actually hear a voiceover of Daryl praying, which I thought was lovely. This is very much going to be a journey of faith for Daryl. And I feel like, way back right after Coda, when Team Delusional first cropped up and we were trying to figure out what was going on and how they could possibly have truly killed her off, and it just didn't make any sense. More than once, we talked about how Daryl kind of has to be worthy of Beth coming back. And I don't mean in a romantic way or as a person. It really comes down to he's got to have the faith. And only after that will she appear. That's what I mean. It is a story of faith, and the miracle is not going to happen until after the show of faith from him. And so in the preview, we have a voiceover of him saying a prayer. And it's a very Daryl-ish prayer. It's very his personality, and certainly not the kind of thing we would hear from a deeply religious person, but it's still there. And that was delightful. I was so excited to hear that. And I just think this is going to be a really lovely journey for him. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. So I'm all kinds of geeking out about episode 1, and I love it. Tell me what you think in the comments. Did you like it? What did you like? What did you not like? And how excited are you for episode 2? Meanwhile, I'll be back next week with another analysis. Bye.